On the night of July 23, 2021, Veronika Korobkina found herself in the company of 4 men. Before that evening, she was known as an ordinary mother, an ordinary wife. She never made it home that night. To understand how this happened, we need to start a bit earlier. Veronika was 41 years old, red-haired, striking, with 2 tattoos, one on her shoulder and one on her lower back. Married to Andrei, a teenage daughter, an apartment on Ulyanovsk Prospect in Krasnoyarsk. Nothing unusual, unless you know how it all ends. Neighbors would later say the same thing, almost word for word. A normal family. Quiet. Never any noise. Never any parties. One neighbor added that she had just returned from a trip and hadn't even noticed anything had happened until she overheard someone talking about an identification. When journalists reached out to Andrei Korobkin, his response was brief. He only said, "0," and then he went silent. He refused to comment further. So, on the evening of July 22nd, Veronika headed to a friend's place in the Bely Rosie residential complex. She told her husband she'd be home late. She spent the evening there. Everything was calm. Later, a taxi driver's testimony would appear in the case files, and that's where the chain of events would begin to take shape. Veronika got into the car and gave an address on Ulyanovsk Prospect. A routine fare, a short ride, but a few minutes in, her phone rang. Who was on the other end? The driver didn't hear. He only noticed that after the call, she changed the destination. Now she needed to go to 9 Maya Street, to a place called Café Shan's. Café Shan's was a place with its own reputation, the kind that stays open when everything else is closed, cheap alcohol, a random crowd, few questions asked, not a criminal spot in the strict sense, but not the kind of place you go after a family dinner. Who exactly called Veronika? Investigators would establish later, but at that moment, neither the taxi driver nor anyone else knew that this call had altered the course, not just of the ride, but of everything that would follow. The driver dropped her off at Shan's and drove away. Veronika walked in alone. Inside, she ended up at a table with 4 men. They weren't locals, at least not all of them. 2 were brothers from the Berezovsky district, a suburb of Krasnoyarsk. The other 2 had come from the Voronezh region. The youngest was 20, the oldest 34. How exactly the conversation started and who approached first, investigators would piece together later. But the fact remains, Veronika stayed with them and continued drinking. From the outside, it looked like a typical late-night group, a woman in her early 40s and 4 young men she had never seen before in her life. None of the cafe staff would later recall anything alarming. No arguments, no conflicts, no attempts to leave, just people at a table, around 2 in the morning. Shan's began closing. They finished their drinks. One of the men suggested continuing, somewhere else, farther out. Veronika agreed. Why? A question that will never be answered. Maybe she thought there was nothing dangerous about it. Maybe the alcohol dulled her sense of unease, or maybe she simply didn't want to go home. They walked outside and got into a silver Lada Granta. One of the brothers took the wheel. Veronika ended up in the back seat, between 2 of them. The car headed toward Berezovsky district. When she opened her eyes again, there was nothing but forest around her. The city ended quickly. The road passed villages, then ran along the woods. Berezovsky district begins just beyond Krasnoyarsk, a 30 to 40-minute drive from the center, faster at night. By then, Veronika was already asleep. Alcohol, the late hour, the rocking of the back seat, she most likely passed out almost immediately after they left the city. While she slept, the 2 men sitting on either side of her began removing her jewelry, earrings, rings, a necklace, everything she had on her, carefully, without waking her. This is important to understand. This was not a spontaneous act. These were the actions of people who had already made a decision. In the car, before the forest, maybe even back at the cafe. The car turned off the road and stopped in a wooded area. The headlights went dark. Darkness all around. Trees, not a single house for kilometers. At some point, Veronika woke up. What exactly she saw in those first seconds, no one knows. But one thing she understood immediately, the situation she was in had nothing to do with what she had agreed to. 4 men, a forest, night, no signal, no chance of help. Her jewelry was already gone. From this point on, everything investigators would later reconstruct from testimony would look entirely different. The picture would turn out to be horrifying. When Veronika came to, 3 of them had already stopped pretending. What happened next in that forest would later be documented in the case files as a group crime committed against her will. 3 of the 4, both men from Voronezh and the older brother, acted in turn. She had no way to resist. Not physically, not numerically, not situationally. 1 woman against 3 men in a remote forest. No phone, not a single person for kilometers. The 4th, the younger brother, the one behind the wheel, did not participate directly. But he didn't intervene either. He didn't stop them. He didn't drive her back. He simply stood nearby and waited for it to end. Investigators would later classify his role as aiding and abetting. After that, they took her phone, then her bank card. At that point, she had nothing left. No jewelry, no way to communicate, no money, no way to leave. But that still wasn't enough for them. They wanted the PIN code for the card, and what they came up with to get it, even seasoned investigators would struggle to find words for later. One of them grabbed a shovel. It had been lying in the trunk. Investigators would later pay special attention to this detail. The shovel had been brought along, not picked up in the forest, not found by chance. They had taken it in advance. Right in front of Veronika, just a few steps away, 2 of them began to dig, unhurried, methodical. The pit grew deeper. Veronika watched. She understood what it was for. They didn't hide it. The logic was simple. Tell us the PIN. Maybe it'll be okay. Don't tell us. The pit is almost ready. This wasn't an interrogation. It wasn't a verbal threat. This was a person standing and watching as a grave was being prepared in front of them. As would later emerge, accounts differ on how Veronika reacted. According to one version, she categorically refused to speak, and the men had to apply more pressure. According to another, she did everything they demanded almost immediately. Which version is closer to the truth is difficult to establish. The testimony came from the defendants themselves, and each had their own reason to describe the events in their own way. But the outcome is the same. They got the PIN code. Veronika gave up the last thing she had. The code to her card, the last thing that still held any value for them. At this point, logic would suggest, if all they wanted was money, they could let her go. But logic doesn't always apply, and certainly not with people like this. They got the PIN code. But it didn't save Veronika. They made a loop out of an electrical cord. They put it around her neck. They took her life, right there in that same forest, that same night, with those same hands. Then they burned her documents, her passport, everything she had on her, into the fire. As if by destroying the papers they could destroy the person, make it so she simply never existed. And here's a detail that says a great deal. The pit they had dug in front of her, they didn't use it. They buried her somewhere else. They dug a new hole, placed her inside, covered her with dirt and branches. The first pit had been a performance, a tool of pressure. The second was real. After that, the 4 calmly got back into the same Lada Granta and drove away. Back on Ulyanovsk Prospect, Andrei Korobkin was waiting for his wife. She didn't come home that night, or in the morning. Her phone didn't answer. And with each passing hour, the silence grew heavier. In the morning, Andrei dialed his wife's number. No ring. The subscriber you are trying to reach is unavailable or out of network coverage. He dialed again. Same result. He sent a message. It was delivered, and sat there, unanswered. Most likely, he called the friend Veronika had visited the night before. She confirmed, yes, Veronika had left her place that night, called a taxi. After that, nothing. Where she went, who she was with later, the friend didn't know. It was Veronika's mother who raised the alarm, not her husband. The investigative committee would later confirm this. She contacted the police when it became clear her daughter had been unreachable for more than a day. A report was filed, but the story didn't go public right away. News of Veronika Korobkina's disappearance broke only on July 30th, a full week after she vanished. 7 days. In that time, the four were already covering their tracks. And all that time, Veronika lay in the earth of Berezovsky district. No one knew. When the missing person bulletin was finally released, the city saw a face, but didn't yet know the story. From that point, police began tracing her route. They interviewed the taxi driver, pulled surveillance footage, quote 3, and on one of the recordings, they spotted a silver Lada Granta. The cameras near Café Sean's were working, not all of them, but enough. The footage captured the moment Veronika walked out of the establishment, not alone. A group of people beside her. They walked toward a parked car. The plate is readable, standard procedure from there. They ran the registration. The car wasn't registered to any of the men, but to a woman, the partner of one of them. That immediately narrowed the circle. Not stolen, not random. A personal vehicle tied to a specific address and a specific person. But on the footage, investigators noticed something else. Besides the four men, another woman had left the cafe with Veronika. After exiting, the group split up. The woman walked off in one direction. Veronika got into the car with the men. Who was this woman? Did she know what would happen next? Was she a random acquaintance or part of the group? At that point, investigators didn't know. As it later turned out, they would search for her separately. The investigative committee even issued a public appeal asking this woman to come forward and give a statement. But the main thread was already in hand. The car, the owner, through her, the partner, a 29-year-old resident of Berezovsky district. His name was Mikhail Ivanov. On August 1st, the search team reached a location in a wooded area of Berezovsky district. A pit, earth, branches. Beneath them, what had been Veronika Korobkina 9 days earlier. The find was documented. Signs of a violent end were evident even before the forensic examination. That same day, the investigative committee opened a criminal case. Details were not released, not to journalists, not to the family. The official statement was standard. Quote 4. For the investigation, this was both an expected and a pivotal moment. Expected because the route, the cameras, and the car had already pointed in one direction. Pivotal because now the case shifted from a missing person search to an investigation into what had been done to her. For Andrei Korobkin, for Veronika's mother, for the neighbors on Ulyanovsk, this was the end of hope. That thin, irrational, but stubborn hope that holds on as long as there's no final confirmation. Now there was confirmation. From quote 5 to a criminal case number. Krasnoyarsk learned the truth, and the city demanded answers. But the investigation stayed silent. Authorities declined to comment, quote 6. The day after the discovery, they detained the first suspect. He refused to talk. On August 2nd, Mikhail Ivanov was taken into custody. The operation didn't take long. He lived in Berezovsky. Hadn't left. Most likely, he didn't think they'd get to him that fast. Or he thought the pit in the forest was guarantee enough. The investigative committee released interrogation footage. On the recording, a young man, calm, showing no visible signs of remorse. He categorically denied all charges, on every count, gave testimony dryly, briefly. Mostly he stayed silent. Later, his lawyer would try to appeal the arrest. Unsuccessfully. Ivanov's true character would emerge later, in court. When a journalist turned on a camera in the hallway, he turned sharply. Why is she standing there filming? What is she filming? 30 minutes after that remark, his sentence was read, the harshest of the four. But at that point, the trial was still far off. The situation was this: 1 detained, 3 still free, and not just free. By the time of Ivanov's arrest, his brother and the 2 from Voronezh had already left Krasnoyarsk Krai. They had scattered, vanished. One returned to the Voronezh region, another went even farther. Investigators knew their names, but not their locations. The hunt began, and it would stretch out for nearly a year. Mikhail Ivanov sat in pre-trial detention. The other 3 were already far away by then, each trying to disappear in his own way. The 2 from Voronezh left first, heading west, back toward relatives. The Voronezh region is nearly 4,000 kilometers from Krasnoyarsk. They were betting on distance. The farther from that forest in Berezovsky, the lower the chance anyone would reach them. For a while, that bet paid off. The younger brother, Sundar Ivanov, took a different approach. He didn't flee the region. He stayed in Krasnoyarsk, but tried to lie low, dropped out of contact, changed his habits, tried not to be seen. He would be detained later, but for now, the investigation knew his name and didn't know where he was. The investigative committee placed all three on the federal wanted list. That meant their information went out to every territorial division across the country. Photos, personal data, bulletins, circulating from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. But a wanted listing isn't an arrest. Between the words wanted and detained, months sometimes pass. That's exactly what happened here. And here it's worth returning to one detail. The jewelry they took from Veronika. The four of them pawned it at a pawn shop that same night. They got cash. Not much by any reasonable standard, almost nothing. An entire life of a 41-year-old woman, earrings, rings, a necklace, converted into a sum barely enough for a tank of gas and a couple days of food. For this, they dug a pit, strangled her with a cord, and fled across half the country. They found the second one 6 months later, thousands of kilometers from Krasnoyarsk. 5 months passed before the second arrest. In December 2021, operatives tracked down the 20-year-old suspect in Voronezh. He was on the federal wanted list but wasn't trying very hard to hide. Or maybe he thought Krasnoyarsk was far away and they wouldn't reach him. They reached him. The arrest went without resistance. He was extradited to Krasnoyarsk. By then, investigators already had Mikhail Ivanov's testimony. Though he denied guilt, the picture was gradually forming from fragments. Cameras, route, car, pawn shop. And now there was a second person to interrogate. What exactly he said during the first interrogations isn't disclosed in public sources, but by this point the case had been reclassified. It was no longer about one suspect. It was about a group, 4, and 2 of them were still free. The geography of this case sprawled across the map: Berezovsky district, Krasnoyarsk, Voronezh, and more arrests were still ahead. On the night of April 28, 2022, 9 months after that night in the forest, Krasnoyarsk operatives were already in the Voronezh region. They weren't flying blind. By then, investigators knew the name of the third man, Samir Christu, 34 years old. But finding him proved harder than finding the second one. Christu wasn't sitting in the city or hiding with relatives. He had settled in a village, quietly, unnoticed, with a local woman. He was living like a man who wasn't in any hurry and wasn't running from anyone. Ordinary life, ordinary house. Nothing suspicious from the outside. Criminal investigation operatives from the Krasnoyarsk main directorate worked alongside colleagues from Berezovsky district. They went to the location, carried out the arrest. Christu was extradited to Krasnoyarsk and taken into custody. The Железнодорожный district court authorized a 2-month detention, so now there were 3 in pretrial detention. And here, an important shift occurred. All 3 began giving testimony. They partially admitted guilt, but each told his own version, and each pointed to the others. Investigators received 3 different perspectives on the same night. The testimonies didn't align on the details. They didn't align on what mattered most, what had happened in that forest. The 4th remained, Sundar Ivanov, the younger brother of Mikhail, the one behind the wheel, the one who didn't participate directly, but didn't stop any of it, and his detention was now close. It would close the final gap in the case. With Sundar Ivanov, things went differently. He wasn't caught through a federal manhunt, and he wasn't tracked down through relatives' addresses. He was brought in. All 4 suspects turned out to be Roma, originally from the Voronezh region. When Krasnoyarsk operatives started working through the detainees' connections, they reached a settlement. And here, something happened that the investigation probably didn't expect. The Roma elder cooperated. He didn't cover for his own. He didn't stay silent. He didn't deflect. On the contrary, he found common ground with the police and personally brought one of the wanted men to the station. Sundar was 24 at the time, Mikhail's younger brother, the one who drove the Lada Granta that night, the one who drove everyone into the forest, waited while everything happened, and then drove back. Now, all four were in custody. Mikhail Ivanov since August 2021, the second since December, Samir Christou since late April 2022, and Sundar last of all. By this point, the full picture had been reconstructed. 4 people, one night, a cafe, a car, a forest, a cord, a pit, a pawn shop, flight. Krasnoyarsk police dedicated an episode of their program, quote, "Tend to this manhunt." The hunt lasted nearly a year, but it was over. Now it was the court's turn. But there was still one more person who never sat in the defendant's seat, not because they fled, but because the investigation couldn't find them. Or rather, couldn't find her. On December 7, 2021, the investigative committee issued a public appeal. Investigators were searching for a woman who had been at Café Shan's on the night of July 23rd alongside Veronika and the 4 men. She was visible on the surveillance footage, short, dark hair with light highlights, an elongated bob, a light blue sundress, name presumably Alyona. Estimated age, 23 to 25. Investigators wanted answers. The appeal was published with a physical description. Anyone who recognized the woman was asked to call the main investigative department or the police. Krasnoyarsk and Voronezh media circulated the bulletin. The result is unknown. In public sources, there is not a single mention of Alyona being found, no confirmation, no denial. She remains a figure from a surveillance camera, a woman in a blue sundress who walked off in another direction. Maybe that saved her life. Maybe she knew more than anyone thought, or maybe she knew nothing at all. This thread was left hanging, and the case went to trial without her. On May 5, 2023, the Krasnoyarsk Regional Court began reading the verdict. In the room, 4 defendants, guards, a journalist, and Veronika's mother, Svetlana. She sat 2 meters away from the men who did this to her daughter. The list of charges took a long time to read. Robbery by a group crime against the victim's will, destruction of documents, armed robbery, aiding and abetting. And the main charge, what happened at the end of that night in the forest, 4 men, 4 roles, 1 victim. Investigators had classified each person's actions separately based on their degree of involvement. In the courtroom, the 4 were quiet. Not at all like they were that night. Silent. They didn't answer journalists' questions. When one of them was approached with a microphone, "Do you agree with the verdict?" The answer was brief. "Let's step aside." Veronika's mother would say it plainly afterward. Quote 13. The Ivanov brothers' family didn't enter the courtroom. They waited outside. When journalists approached them, they replied, quote 14. Between them, the 2 brothers had 6 young children. Their wives remained free. Svetlana sat calmly in the courtroom. No more tears. After 2 years, there simply weren't any left. But she said one thing that stayed with everyone who heard it. He could have saved her, Sundar. When he went to the settlement to buy beer, there was somewhere to turn for help right nearby. He could have gone, not for beer, but for help. He didn't lay a finger on her, and he still got 5 years. The judge read out the sentences. Mikhail Ivanov, 23 years in a maximum security penal colony, plus 1 year of restricted freedom after release. The harshest of the 4. Samir Christou, 21 years in a maximum security colony, the one who was on the run the longest, the one who had hidden in a Voronezh village with a local woman. Second highest sentence, and second in degree of involvement in what happened in that forest. Mikhail, the second, 6 years and 6 months in a standard regime colony, the youngest of the 4. His role was classified differently by investigators. He hadn't participated in everything. Sundar Ivanov, 5 years in a standard regime colony, the driver, the one who drove them there, waited and drove them back, the one who could have driven for help, but drove to get beer instead. In addition to the sentences, the court ordered compensation to the family, 1 million rubles from each of the 4. The remaining civil claims were denied. Svetlana heard the verdict. Then, in front of the camera, she said simply, quote 16, "No outrage, no demands for harsher punishment, just, I agree. 2 years of waiting, a nationwide manhunt, a trial, and 4 numbers on paper, 23, 21, 6.5, 5. At the time of the verdict, it had not yet entered into legal force. The convicted men retained the right to appeal. Legally, the case was not yet closed. But for Svetlana, for Andrei, for the neighbors on Ulyanovsk, it ended here. Justice had done its work. 4 men received their sentences, but one question still remains unanswered, the one everyone asked, from investigators to neighbors: why would a married woman, at 1 a.m, go alone to a cafe with a questionable reputation? The answer to that question would turn out to be more complicated than anyone thought. The 4 were sentenced. The case was closed. But after the verdict, there were more questions, not fewer. And who made the call? Investigators established that, but the information never became public. Komsomolskaya Pravda Krasnoyarsk ran a headline claiming, quote, 17. If that's true, then the acquaintance wasn't random. Then one of the 4 had her number. Then contact existed before that night. But the court established something else. Veronika met the men inside the cafe. 2 versions, both from official sources. Which is closer to the truth was never publicly clarified. Then there's another detail. Andrei Korobkin, it seems, didn't immediately realize his wife hadn't come home, or he realized, but didn't immediately act. Why? Was he used to her coming home late? Did he not want to make a scene? Or was there something between them the neighbors didn't know about? Andrei gave journalists exactly 1 line, and then went silent. He never commented again, not about that evening, not about the call, not about whether he knew where she was going. A husband's silence isn't evidence, but it's a pause that says more than words. Perhaps behind that silence lies a part of life that others didn't see, or didn't want to see. Those who knew Veronika more closely than the neighbors stayed silent out of respect, out of fear, out of a reluctance to dig. But the truth, as it usually does, doesn't ask permission. There are the facts, and there's what lies behind them. The facts are these. She didn't call her husband. She didn't hesitate. She just went, as if it wasn't the first time. A mother usually worries when she knows what to fear, when she's already seen, or at least suspected, that her daughter isn't living quite the way she claims. And now, what cannot be confirmed by documents, but what emerges from everything we know. Perhaps behind the facade of that quiet apartment on Ulyanovsk Prospect, there was another life. Late-night outings under the guise of visits to a friend, casual encounters with random company. By all appearances, Veronika liked attention, liked the ease of the nightlife, and couldn't give it up. Not after marriage, not after having a daughter, and that mysterious call in the taxi? Probably not a trap. Most likely, it was part of a familiar pattern. Someone she knew invited her to continue the night, and Veronika agreed without a second thought. It can be assumed that the mother knew, or at least suspected. That's why she raised the alarm first. Not because she was more anxious than the husband, but because she understood. If her daughter hadn't come home, it meant what she had always feared had happened. And it can be assumed that Andrei learned the truth only later, when the investigation reconstructed the route, when it became clear where she had gone and why. Veronika Korobkina did not deserve what was done to her. No one does. 4 men received their sentences, and that is right. No late-night bar, no risky decision gives anyone the right to do what happened in that forest. But this story isn't only about them. It's about the price people pay for living a double life, about how, for years, you can walk along the edge and believe the edge will never end. About one decision, quote 18, that became the last. And about the facade behind which sometimes hides a loneliness a person doesn't know what to do with, a loneliness that drives them into the night, towards something from which there is no return. Dear viewers, you've just heard a story that clearly lacked psychological help. That woman most likely needed support, and her family needed it too. If something is happening in your family that goes beyond what's normal, that goes beyond what's generally accepted, don't keep it inside. Address issues gradually as they arise. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.